hear me, guys? On behalf of the 5th edition of DSC Jaipur Literature Festival, Teamwork and all our partners, we welcome you to the Rio Tinto SAMVAD. Our evening session is India in Translation, from the exotic to the contemporary. In conversation, Oscar Pujol and Fakrul Alam, introduced by Urvashi Butalia. Over to you. Thank you. Can I just request you to please switch off or put your mobiles in silent mode? You'll be given 10 minutes later to ask all your questions.
Thank you. Welcome all of you. I'm getting to be a familiar sight, I think, at the Jaipur Festival because I'm introducing and moderating many sessions. I'm delighted to be welcoming Oscar and Fakrul. Our third speaker is unfortunately not here, but we have two very unusual speakers. Oscar Pujol is a Sanskritologist and Indologist. He studied at Banaras Hindu University, where he spent, 17 years? Yes, 16 years. And he has also put together a labor of love over 12 years, a Catalan Sanskrit dictionary. He is currently also heads the Cervantes Institute in Delhi, which is an institute which comes under the aegis of the Embassy of Spain, if I guess rightly, which holds many cultural events and so on, and he himself is an accomplished translator and a very well-known one. Fakrul Alam from the Department of English at the University of Dhaka. Some of you will be familiar with him as one of the judges on the DSC award jury this year. And Dr. Alam is also a very well-known and well-respected academic, teaching at the University of Dhaka, where he has been for many years, and he speaks very movingly of how he has been associated with the university for so long that it has become part of him and his thinking and his system and his blood, more or less. He is author of several books, several academic books of essays and writings on literature and on translation. He is also a translator himself, has translated the poems of Jibananda Das, who is a poet who had a very formative influence on him, as also the poetry of Tagore. And both of them will be talking to you about the enterprise of translation and what it means, and how translating India has moved from a perception of India as the exotic to a perception of India as much more multi-layered and nuanced, and a country where modernity and tradition are both in confluence and in contestation. So I'm going to turn it over. Oscar, would you like to go first and address the subject a little bit, and then Fakrul follows, or would you like to go first? Oscar.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Jaipur Literary Festival. Well, this session has several issues, and I will start rather with translation, with another very interesting topic, and then give you a... rather than now beginning with fixing my attention in translation, I would like to dwell a little bit on the images that the West has built about India. I think it's not translation literally, but it is very important, because the first thing I would like to say, that India, it is a very special country for the West. I mean that unlike other countries, and I say that, India has been always a part of the collective imaginary of the West, right from the time of the Greek. In fact, the West has been dreaming of India since the Greek period in many different ways, sometimes strange ways that may even startle the Indian perception. And the ways that the West has been thinking about India, sometimes, and especially after the colonization, had also a deep influence in the vision that the Indians had of India themselves. And what I would like to say very shortly is that we can trace in the past, right from the period of the Greeks to the present era, at least 6 very different images of India. And these 6 images of India, they are, I think, we'll take the trouble to see them a little bit, all of them. The first one, I say, is exotic India. The second image of India will be wealthy India. The third image of India will be trading India. The fourth image of India will be knowledge India. And, wait a minute, the fifth, I say knowledge India. Then you have another image of India, which is spiritual India, also a very important one. And the last image, which come actually from the 19th century, which is a very important one, is underdeveloped India, the India of poverty, the India of misery, which is very dominant. No? I would like to say, out of these 6 images, there are 2 who have been very conspicuous all through the history of Western perception of India. And these 2 are exotic India and spiritual India. And mind you, there is another image of India which was prevalent in ancient times up to the 19th century, and it was wealthy India. I want to remark this. For the imagination of Europe, India was a land of plenty, starting right now from the Greek period up to the 18th century, where still the splendor and the richness of the Mughal courts were a common topic, say, in France, and it was represented on the stage, the splendors of the Mughal court in India, a very successful theater place, still in the 18th century. The 19th century changed this perception dramatically. And instead of being a wealthy India, becomes a poor India, underdeveloped India, an oppressive India, an India of a kind of Oriental despotism. But let's put a little bit of order in what I am saying, right? I will go back and I will try to be short and let's examine again. The first 3 images, and I repeat, exotic India, wealthy India, and spiritual India, come right from the time of the Greek travelers to India. These are let's see the first one, exotic India. For the Greeks, India was first of all a country full of strange beings with trees that were giving wool, that was the cotton tree, with a kind of, with rivers of honey and milk, etc., 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 with also these fabulous ants that were digging gold in the desert, most probably here in Rajasthan. That was a very common myth in the Greek. They said in India is such a land of wealth and plenty that there are some ants that go into the desert and they dig the sand and they extract gold from the sand. Now these ants are very dangerous, are big ants, and when there is a lot of sand, the ants go into siesta, into sleep, and then the Indians go and snatch the gold from the ants, right? So this thing that to us seems now very fantastic, added to the idea of a very wealthy India. Even Herodotus says in his book that the most important natural resources of the world are in this area. So you can imagine, exotic with plenty of strange beings, very wealthy land, and the third image that the Greeks really, and it was very important, was the land of the naked sages. What they used to say, gymnosophies, right? This is important because the Greeks were already having the ideal by the Stoics and by the Cynics and by the Pythagoreans of this kind of gymnosophist sage, which somehow goes away from civilization, from the hypocrisy of society, and finds the truth in asceticism. So when the Greeks came to India, they found what they were looking for, because they were. So these 3 images, and I will now, are right from the Greek time and come till now. Even the image of exotic India is now being used by the Indian government when you say incredible India, right? It's still very much alive in the, and as Fakrul will say later, no? And as Amartya Sen has said also, the image of exotic and spiritual India has done both lot of good and lot of harm to the Indian perception. Because it's been often the case that Westerners that become fascinated with India give a completely real and idealistic vision of India, and when they come here, or when they spend some time here, they get disenchanted, and they give the opposite the view of India as a land of superstition, of etc., etc., etc. So this is very important, that the exotic image of India can be very dangerous to a proper and good image of contemporary India. So we have three images right now. I would like to go to the fourth image, trying to be quick in my exposition. The fourth image is very interesting. It's very interesting also to me as a Spanish man, because the fourth image of India is the India of knowledge. I don't say the India of the spiritual knowledge, but of scientific knowledge. And you will be surprised to know that the India, thinking of India as a land of knowledge, say a land of mathematics, they invented the zero, as a land of astronomy, as a land of medicine, that image of India as a land of knowledge came to Europe through the Islam of Spain. This is a very important thing. The numerical decimal system was introduced, I say, thanks to a school of translators in the 10th and 11th century in Spain called the School of Toledo. These people, for the first time, they translated a book by Al-Khwarizmi called Hisab al-Hind, which means the method of counting of the Indians. So this book introduced from Arabic into Latin. We have still the manuscripts in Madrid, and there you can find the first zero in Europe written in those manuscripts. These numbers, for 50 years, were known in Europe as Toledan numbers, from the Spanish city of Toledo. And after that, they were known with the name of Arabic numbers, okay? Although we know that they are Indians. Anyway, this image of India as a land of intellectual excellence was so well entrenched in medieval Spain, in Muslim Spain, I cannot but resist the temptation to read you a quotation from a Spanish Muslim. He was Ibn al-Said, called also Ibn al-Andalusi, because he was from South Spain. And in a book from the 11th century, of course, Ibn Arabi been there. In a book from the 11th century called The Catalogue of Nations, when he speaks of India, he speaks in such terms. Among the nations of the world, over the passage of centuries and the passage of time, India was known as a veritable mine of wisdom and as a source of justice and good governance. The Indians have been regarded as individuals who demonstrate an excellent understanding of high ideas, of universal principles, of rare talents and inventions. They have studied arithmetic and astronomy. They have acquired a wealth of knowledge on the movements of stars, the secrets of celestial sphere, and on the various subtleties of the science of mathematics. Moreover, among all the peoples, they are the most knowledgeable in the science of medicine and have a thorough knowledge of the properties of medicinal plants, the nature of compound elements, and the peculiarities of existing things. So I think this speaks for itself. I see this is the text of a Muslim in 11th century Spain. Now, this idea of India as a land of intellectual knowledge, which it's coming again now after all these centuries, right? Influenced Voltaire, and I would like to say that if you go to the Voltaire was perhaps the European intellectual who has, to me, the most progressive and modern idea about India. For Voltaire, India was the cradle of civilization, the civilization that invented numbers, that invented chess, that invented didactic literature, etc., etc. So I wanted to dwell in this image of India as a land of knowledge because during the centuries it got forgotten, more or less, right? It got forgotten because the image of India as a spiritual land was too powerful and impinging on the European imagination. Well, and finally, I would say the last image is an image of India, of poor India, right? Underdeveloped India. And not only underdeveloped India, but also India of despotism, undemocratic India, the India of social oppression, of inequality, etc., etc., etc. This was so because basically done during the 19th century, when the whole perception, positivism was there, the whole conception of wealth, of civilization changed. And then instead of seeing at the Maharajas as something exotic, they were seeing as plain oppressors, etc., etc. No? Now, in the 20th century and the 21st century, a new image of India is emerging. And I think this is very important, to go beyond the double, which is still very important in the West. India is spiritual, but it's an irrational country. And because it is spiritual, it's not doing so well, because religion is still very important, and it's full of superstition, etc., etc. I think this is wrong, because the dichotomies that the West has experienced between science and religion, or to put it another way, between rational knowledge and faith, I think it's not the same value in the Indic tradition. I will just finish and give room to Fakrul by saying one thing which is very important, and it relates to Tagore. No? As I said, the reception of many Indian, I would say, cultural artifacts has been filtered through this exoticism. The same happens with Tagore. When at the first moment, Tagore was really defended by Ezra Pound, by Yeats, but many other Anglo-Saxon authors. But very quickly, it was a kind of disenchantment. And somehow, all this greatness that was seen in Tagore was reduced to a kind of Oriental poet, which is, with his imaginary of nature, etc., etc. So it's very important, in my opinion, out of these 6 images, to reinforce, and it's happening, images that were not so predominant in ancient times, but that now emerge again with strong force. I mean, the image of India as a land of intellectual excellence, the image of India as a trading nation, which I didn't touch here, but it was also very important in ancient times. I would like to remember you that in the 1st century BC, a community of Indian traders were living in Alexandria, so that right in the Mediterranean. And, as you know also, a community of Roman. They had emporiums in South India. So there was a lot of connection between the Mediterranean and India at that time. So I would say the image of India as an intellectual country, as a wealthy country, and as a country of trade, and as a secular country, I think they are re-emerging in this 21st century, and I think we should go a little bit further. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Now, I don't have Oscar's length and breadth of scholarship, and so but as he was speaking, I was reminded, almost except for the 4th, the intellectual India and the travel India, about the whole business of representations, about which ever since Said wrote Orientalism in 1978, we've become very conscious about. That the India that has been presented, there was another book by an historian called Ronald Inden, which came out of Said, called Essentializing India. And so what the images, the 4 images, if we exclude those 2, are all about essentializing India, stereotyping India, and it's a kind of reductive aspect of India that we get to see. And I'll take it to Rabindranath after that, to Tagore, Rabindranath in Bangla, and Tagore after that. But before I do that, I'd like to point out that the session, the title of the session is From the Exotic to the Contemporary, and let's like to begin anecdotally. Anecdotally, because I am what you could call a frequent flyer to India. I mean, because of the conference circuit, because of friends, I seem to be coming to India twice, thrice a year, and I've been doing that over 20 years now. And this has stopped lately, thankfully, the last 7, 8 years. But in the late 90s and the early part of this millennium, the first decade, whenever I would come to a conference and I would meet somebody, the question that I would inevitably be asked is about Taslima Nasreen. And everyone seemed to be interested in Taslima Nasreen and her writing and so on. Now, initially I was enthusiastic. I think Taslima Nasreen is a very good writer, and of course I have great sympathy for what has happened to her, and I also think that her work on feminism is not to be neglected at all. But what was happening was a kind of exoticization also, because it was not as if Bangladesh didn't have other writers. In fact, in Bangladeshi, contemporary Bangladeshi poetry, Bangladeshi fiction, there are many very great writers, but they just don't get translated. It is this image of Taslima Nasreen as an oppressed women that seem to attract publishing houses everywhere. And so what we have is, again, a kind of stereotyping and a kind of a reduction. And there's a kind of othering that goes on in this image making that I thought was very good in what you said. I'd like to now take it to subject that I think I feel most competent to talk about, and Oscar allows me to get into this subject immediately, and that is of Rabindranath. The last few years I've been working more or less focused on Rabindranath and Radha Chakraborty of Delhi's University of Gargi College and Gargi College of the University of Delhi, and I have brought out a book last year called The Essential Tagore. And in writing the book and in researching for it, the thing that came to me is how Rabindranath's image through translation has been filtered. And it has been filtered not entirely the West's fault, I would say. I think Rabindranath himself, to some extent, must be faulted for what has happened. But I think it's interesting to talk about all of this in this panel. Well, first of all, when Rabindranath went with Gitanjali, with the manuscript of Gitanjali, and showed it to Rothenstein in England, and then Rothenstein actually talked to Yeats, and then Yeats and Rothenstein arranged this evening where Ezra Pound and the others were there. They immediately took to Rabindranath, and they took to Rabindranath's poetry, took to Rabindranath's poetry because of the mystical element, or what they perceived to be the mystical element, and the purity of the mysticism, more than anything else, the pure voice. Because Yeats was no phony. For him it was a genuine thing. And it was something that all of them were feeling just as the World War was turning, just appearing on the scene. The war was about to break open. And so the book sold very well because it was a wasteland. It was a moral wasteland. It was a wasteland looking for clues, looking for answers, and Rabindranath seemed to have at least given some answers at that time. And a year later, Ezra Pound was denouncing Rabindranath, and soon Yeats was different. He didn't denounce Rabindranath, he denounced Rabindranath's translations later. I'll come back to that later, but he was getting disillusioned. And I think, looking back, it seems to me that Yeats had it to a great extent right, because what Yeats was bothered was the kind of translations Rabindranath was doing. Because Rabindranath, and here Rabindranath was also translating, the success of Gitanjali meant that there was a huge demand for his books. And so he started translating, and then he allowed others to translate, and he vetted the translations and allowed them to be published. But initially he began to translate only poems which were devotional and mystical. Later on he translated love poems, poems for children. But what was happening was that the poems were being translated in the same way. It was as if the poems did not have any variations, which is absolutely not true in Bangla. If you read Rabindranath, you know that one collection of Rabindranath's poems is very different from the second. The second is very different from the third. He's a poet who refused to repeat himself and who kept moving from one to the other. But when you look at the poems, what was happening was that there was a kind of plastic poetry, plastic translation that was coming into view. And so, because of the bulk of the translation of Rabindranath, and also because the West was now not wanting to hear the mystical Rabindranath anymore, his popularity fell, and the translations, the demand for the translations began to slide. And so eventually we had the exotic Rabindranath staying, but the other Rabindranath, partly because of the quality of the translations, partly because this was not what the West wanted to listen to, that disappeared. So it seems to me that there we have an example of how exoticism, the need to represent India in a certain light, led to a huge demand and huge interest. But I would also like to stress the other thing, as a translator myself, bad translations can also contribute to the part. So with that, I'd like to end this part.
Well, Well, thanks. I think he's provided a very clear example of what happened, because I think Rabindranath Tagore was cut out to a single vision of mysticism, while he's much more than that. And that's still, I mean, the first thing I would like to commend that the fascination for Tagore in the Hispanic world never ended, unlike the Anglo-Saxon world, and that's a very important thing. Tagore was translated in Spanish by a Nobel Prize called Juan Ramón Jiménez, and Juan Ramón Jiménez was so much influenced by Tagore that he began to practice what he said naked poetry because of Gitanjali. And this naked poetry, without too many adjectives, without too many, figures of speech and all this kind of thing, became, very influential in the 27th generation in Spain, which we have such great poets as García Lorca. So we can see that Tagore somehow, even now in the Hispanic world, because he got such good translations by a person like himself, a poet, still now, he's a bestseller. And the place of Tagore in the Hispanic world is still there. That's one difference between perhaps, the reception of Tagore in the Hispanic world and the Anglo-Saxon. And I would like to add another thing because of what you say, I mean, I think Fakrul Alam has touched a very important point when we speak of translating India, especially into European languages. I think there is there are many Bangla words that have been never translated. And there is a huge asymmetry, in our knowledge, the Western knowledge of contemporary Indian literature. Because we know very well the writers in English, but we know almost nothing about the writers in Indian languages. Tagore, of course, is an exception, no? And there are several reasons to this, And I said, as a head of the Cultural and Language Institute of Spanish in India, I say, I need translators from Spanish into Indian languages, and I am not finding these translators, right? I'm not finding them. There is a huge problem, I tell you. Indian people, and I'm speaking now about North India, more or less. We have the Indian people who know Spanish. They don't have enough knowledge of Hindi, which is a difficult language to translate, right? Because they've been raised in a more Anglo-Saxon tradition. So when we try to translate a Spanish work into Hindi, we find that the translations are done by scholars and they don't sound well. And we have here a huge problem, I'm speaking, right now in Spanish you can only translate directly from 3 Indian languages into Spanish. Basically, Sanskrit, of course, Hindi and Urdu. I want to translate Bengali into Spanish. I have a boy that will do that, but with the help of another Spaniard. So, I mean to say, and that's very important, and I think that is general. It took to the West 150 years in produce good translations of the most translated Indian language, which till date is still Sanskrit. It took 150 years, because the translations we had in the 19th century were either unfaithful beauties, they were very beautiful, but they were unfaithful, they were not reflecting the original text, or they were faithful monsters, that you need the original to understand them. It still happens, So it was only after the Second World War, and especially in the States, that a certain number of scholars came with beautiful and faithful translations from Sanskrit. So because you need a whole tradition of translation to produce good works. And this is very important. And I will pass to you now. But because when Rushdie, and he never came finally, when Rushdie, many years ago, he said that Indian literature in vernacular, which is a word that I hate, in vernacular languages is not good. He couldn't say that. Why? Because I'm sure that he never read the originals. Maybe he can read, I'm sure he can read Urdu perhaps, and Hindi perhaps, and Marathi perhaps. But he won't be able to read. And so, what is happening with Indian contemporary literature in Indian languages that is still, even in English, and English is a different case, and you know much more, because you are a translator from an Indian language, and I will know. But still, there is a lot of work to do to get Indian literature in Indian language properly translated into European language?
I'd like to start by saying two things. First of all, I think that good translators are rare, and I think it was Rabindranath's great fortune that Jimenez, poet of his stature, chose to translate him into English, and that there wasn't someone forthcoming. And so for a long time, those of you here who know anything about Bangla literature will have heard about Buddhadev Boshu, one of our outstanding Bengali writers, Bengali modernist poet, editor, and an outstanding translator himself. And Buddhadev Boshu, in his book on Rabindranath, in one of his many books on Rabindranath, said that perhaps the Rabindranath's fortunes have declined and will not come up again because somebody from from the target language, in other words from English, somebody has not been translating Rabindranath at all. We all know, everyone I think in this room knows the famous Frost quotation about poetry as what is lost in translation. And the second thing I would like to say as someone who translates poetry, Rabindranath's poetry and songs, is that translating Rabindranath or any other poet, because I've translated other poets also, is a hit and miss affair. I mean, there are some poems which will be translated easily, some poems which just will resist translation. Some poems which you can translate today and give up in frustration. Some poems which another day will come to you and will be translated. So it was partly, I think, because there were dearth of good translators. I mean, people who could translate into the target language competently because they had native speaker fluency, which was the case with Jimenez, that led to the decline in Rabindranath's reputation. But, you know, it seemed for a time that someone like Radici came in and it seemed that that was the answer. You know, because Radici's in the 80s when he translated, there was a huge increase in popularity, Rabindranath's popularity, because for the first time his poems were being translated into English and were available into English. But I think the good news is that since the 80s, after Radici, there have a lot of people been working together to translate not only Rabindranath, other bhasha, texts into English. And now I think we have a new generation of translators right across Indian languages who are translating, and the readership is increasing, and the exotic element is now declining as other books are being translated. So translating is going to be difficult. It's going to be restricted, and we'll need good writers, not necessarily target language translators like Jimenez, because they are really rare. Good translators are rare as it is. But I think that the time is coming perhaps when we'll have an explosion of translation, good translations, and the exotic element will go, and contemporary writing will come into focus from India into other parts of the world.
Both of you, two of you, just to ask, what do you think, you talked about Rabindranath's work earlier being translated and flattened in some ways, and a lot of the work really not receiving attention. Do you think a bad translation is better than no translation in the sense of creating an awareness of something? And also I'm reminded of the Simone de Beauvoir translation of The Second Sex for 60 years, which has survived for 60 years, and which was a translation which excised at least 10 to 15% of the original book, but it still remained a key text. So on balance, what's the better option?
I would say that bad translations should never be welcome. I think that really bad translations, if I go by Rabindranath, can damn. And in English there's this phrase, damn with faint praise. And that's not a fate, I think, a major writer like Rabindranath or Jivanananda Das or Nazrul in Bengali, any of these writers, that they deserve. But there is another option. Someone called Clinton Seeley, who basically went to Borishal in Bengal and fell in love with Bengal, and then fell in love with Jivanananda Das, the great Bengali poet, translated Jivanadash into English, and they were not, I would say, good translation in the sense that the poetry didn't come across, but they were never bad translations. They were competent translations. And because they were competent, and because they got a lot of it across, and he was also the first biographer of Jivananda, I think there was a kind of revival, and if you go to the West, people after Rabindranath will, I've met people who are interested in Jivananda, and Jivananda is now being taught in India also in other universities, in other courses. So it seems to me that since good translations are rare, good translators are rare, since bad translations are bad, for the poet, at least what we can hope for is competent translations. I think that would be something that would keep the traffic across literature moving, and I think that is what is important.
Well, I tend to agree with you, you know, the bad translation are bad. It depends how bad they are, right? In the Hispanic world, the problem we have is that we have a lot of indirect translations. So you translate from Hindi into English and then from English into Spanish, which is also bad. But sometimes you come across some good indirect translations also. So basically, I do agree with you. And but I would add that sometimes bad translations can be also quite fertile. And don't say that that's good. I would like to give a very funny example from Sanskrit literature about a bad translation which became so popular, this bad translation. It's about a word. I don't know, you know what means Hamsa? Hamsa means in Hindi, also in Sanskrit, swan, right? Swan is Hamsa is swan, right? Okay. So that was translated, I think, in the 19th century, Hamsa, swan. But now, the good thing about it is that Hamsa never meant swan. There were no swans in ancient India. And that's been proved by biologists that there were no swans. And what Hamsa actually was referring to a kind of flamingo goose, a special goose, which was very tall and graceful while walking, that because of the metaphors. So now, some Englishmen got it wrong, okay, and translated Hamsa into swan, instead of being a goose. Then all India now thinks that Hamsa is a swan. But the interesting thing, if you see miniatures before the coming of the British about histories from the Mahabharata, say Nala and Damayanti, you will see that instead of a swan, there is a flamingo there. Now, when you buy in contemporary India, say the edition from Gita Press of Mahabharata, and you look Nala and Damayanti episode and you open, then the goose has become a swan. So this is really funny, no? And it's the way that I say bad translations are also somehow creative, and now we have plenty of swans in India, by the way.
How can you set that right? How can you...
Well, because you can see in the miniatures and no.
What I mean is that kind of mistake, if you like, which continues and continues and then acquires the status of a truth.
You know, I think here Fakrul perhaps can help me. And there is one thing which we call equivalence in the, you know, the good thing. I mean, Hamsa, translated as a swan, has a good point. That the Hamsa play a similar role in India as the swan played in Western literature. The same thing, the lotus, more or less, of course, it's not the same, but as a symbol of purity, of whiteness, etc., etc. Something similar happens with the camel or lotus. Again, you cannot translate lotus for rose. That will be wrong. But the lotus and the rose have played somehow parallel roles in the imaginary. The rose has been symbol of wisdom in the West, like the lotus, etc., etc.
Well, I would like to insist that bad translations and distorted translations should not work. It all depends on the translator. All of us, I think, are more or less aware of Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald has famously, he has boasted that one can do anything with the Persian that one pleases. And he has mistranslated, and in mistranslating created a wonderful translation, you know. And I think that is because of his own competence. I mean, he was cavalier about Persian. So he could have translated Hansa and made it into something else. But the end product was good. And so I would say that what is important is to have people who really have a feel for translating, feel for the target language. I think that is very important. And of course, we don't want Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald has a kind of imperial colonizing attitude, but at least people who are creative. So even if there are distortions, there is an element of creativity. If you have a bad translator translating uncreatively, I think that's disastrous. Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up to questions, if there are any questions from the audience. With the mic going round.
My question is for Mr. Pujol. As a lexicographer and a European person who's seen both Europe and India, you're talking about translations from India to Spanish not being, Indian languages to Spanish not being that effective, or European languages. But when we look at world literature in general, when you look at the impact on Indian audiences, even the English-speaking audiences, when you look at Russian literature or Latin American or South American literature, that has had a far greater impact than, say, a Spanish or a Portuguese or an Italian author by himself. French authors like Sartre and Camus have had an impact, but so could you hear me? Yeah, I said the French authors might have made an impact like Sartre or Camus, but when we look at world literature in India, among the audience, Spanish, Italian or German authors have not had that much of an influence as, say, Russian or South American. What could be the reason for that?
I can only talk about Bengali literature, and I think once again we come to competent translations, because in Bangla, Buddhadev, I've mentioned him earlier on, translated Baudelaire, and through him, I think Baudelaire and French poetry have had a major impact on subsequent Bangla poetry. So, it's the fate of the writer to, if he comes in the hand of a good translator, that can make a difference.
And to answer, well, you forgot one author who really made an impact in India, and that was the author, and I will say the name later, of Don Quixote, right? You had versions of Don Quixote right from the 19th century in Bengali, in Tamil, sometimes in direct translations. Now he's being translated. So Don Quixote, Cervantes, which is the institution I am heading, by the way, make already there is another Spanish author which I think is very present in India, which is Garcia Lorca, especially in Bengal. You're right, no? But of course, I would like to say, I think how India is looking to the West, India looks through the West, even now, through Anglo-Saxon glasses. And this is a thing that for a non-Anglo-Saxon European like me, it's a sad thing, because the vision you get of the West, it's a very typical vision of the Anglo-Saxon world. That happened because of colonization or whatever, no? I think that is beginning to change. Another thing I would like to say, for us Spaniards, when you say, we don't make much difference between Spanish and Latin American authors. For us, it's like the institution I am heading in Delhi. We are there and we give welcome both to Spanish and Latin American writers. And for us, what is important is the community of Spanish writers from any country. If you begin to write in Spanish, you will be also treated as a Spanish author. That's how I would like to say.
Hello. I'd like to ask both of you about translations of particular texts. I'm thinking of, actually, you left out one image of India, I think, which is the sexual image of India, and I'm thinking about the Kama Sutra, of course, which, and I'm thinking, because if I think of Irish text, Irish Gaelic texts translated into English, they were like sexed down because they were considered to be too, saucy for a wider reading audience. And the same thing with, because texts, you would say, from say Irish into English, were more heavily censored in translation than say images. Now, can you speak a little bit about how it is in Indian context?
I'll pass on that one.
Oh.
All I know is about Richard Burton and translations of the Kama Sutra and the popularity of those translations and the fact that they have gone into successive editions and have probably never gone out of print. So there is a huge demand for that, and it seems to go on. And this would probably fit into the Orientalizing, exoticizing aspect that Oscars began in our panel with.
Well, I think it was true perhaps in the 19th century, beginning, but now I think it's no longer the case. No, now is
If I go back in
yeah,
the earlier days,
right.
but of course Richard Burton was himself quite a man, should we say, with a kind of a lifestyle.
I have seen now censorship during translation, and I have an instance, but not regarding sex, right? Regarding treatment of women. And it's very interesting. It is an indirect translation, but Tulsidas, in writing in Hindi, has a very interesting couplet, and which he says, it's a little bit strong, and says, I love Tulsi, actually. I am a big admirer of the Tulsi Ramayan, but what I'm going to say now is not very flattering. He has a verse which is, he says, drums. He says, I don't remember the whole thing, he says drums. You know it, right? So translating a little bit is drums, I think, and parias, gawars, people from the countryside, pashus, beasts, and women are like drums. They have to be beaten. It's terrible, all right? For a modern, the metaphor is powerful, like he says. Now, in an indirect Spanish translation, this done from the Gita Press edition, I think, the lady translates everything but leaves out woman. Because he thought, yeah, but you are somehow, good for her, but you are correcting Tulsidas, and I don't know if that's... Yeah, certainly.
Any other questions that
Actually, it's not a question, but I would like to, it's a comment and a question. Do you believe that the rationalism of the 20th century, like when Darwinism came and George Bernard Shaw came, and I remember having read that when Tagore and Charlotte visited Shaw, he was asked to describe Shanti Niketan, and he described it as knit with Niketan, because it was a time when people were decrying the imagination and mysticism and those things. Number two, my observation is, as there are barren periods in creativity, there are barren periods in reception of poetry and reception of mysticism or whatever. We have been recently going through a period when there were no recipients, no receivers for poetry of Tagore's kind. To the lady's question, I have not translated Gaelic into English or Hindi, but I have read a bit of Gaelic, and I have translated James Hinch and Shaw into Hindi, and people have accepted some of the most forbidden language used by James Hinch into Hindi. So, there is a change in the audience, and things do come back. I don't know about Tagore, but how far do you feel that rationalism, Darwinism, Lamarck, and all John Osborne, this era was responsible for sort of letting writers like Tagore into the background? Thanks.
Okay, I'll just make a quick answer to that. I think that as a translator, I would say that the translator has to dare. The translator has to take up challenges. And it's only when you dare and when you take up challenges that you'll have, you'll miss. I already said it's a hit and miss affair. You'll miss, but there might, something that no one thought ever would be translated, will be translated in there. And it has happened again and again in the history of translation. And surely it will happen again. So it's only like everything else which is creative. I think in translation, it's only the limits to our imagination that can limit us. And if we dare, at least I believe that's the case with me, if we dare, then once in a while you might come up with something which is exciting and which will be important.
Okay, the last question, because Oscar has a flight to catch, so we'll have to end this session a bit early. Could you make it brief, just the last one?
This is for Dr. Pujol. I'll just take up one of the images of India that you mentioned, the India of knowledge. And in that context, this is a request if you could throw some light on the contribution perhaps of Indian poetics and Indian aesthetics in the intellectual, makeup of the West. And if you see any difference between the European, impression of Indian aesthetics and the Anglo-Saxon, particularly the English version of it, because the contribution of some European scholars has been immense in this field.
Well, I am no specialist in English literature, and I have here, but I was struck, by the famous theory of Eliot about, he says, the objective correlate, objective correlative. When you read the sentence, it looks like a translation of the Rasa Sutra of Bharat in the Natya Shastra. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know that he knew India. I don't think he knew that sutra specifically because it was not so well known at that time but to start with this, that the objective correlative, finds, an antecedent in the Rasa Sutra of Bharat. And that right now, the interest for Rasa theory is huge in the West. But here comes, another question which I think is very interesting. That the assimilation of Western, of Indian scholarship, and I say rational scholarship theories, into Western scholarship has still not taken place fully. So that still now, I think many Western scholars which know nothing about India, they only are interested in literary theories, will be very interested in knowing about the Rasa Sutra. But the much more, and this we could say in psychology, also in logics, also in grammar has been done much more work. So I mean to say that there is still a lot of work to do to recover from Sanskrit texts analytical knowledge and make this knowledge useful in contemporary discussions. So this is, I think, in my opinion, this is a work still to be done. And still you find many Indian scholars that know very well Western theories, but they don't know the Sanskrit theories. And I think that's something that can be somehow corrected. But in my opinion, and there is still a wealth of knowledge to be recovered from those texts that can be put to use.
So I think we have to close the session. Thank you, both of you, and thank you to all for being here.
A warm thanks to Mr. Oscar, Mr. Fakrul and Urvashi ji for this session. The festival, this session was sponsored by French Embassy, and we would like to tell you that the festival merchandise is available at the store next to the book signing, and the festival